Well, our next speaker is Dr. Justin Sexten. Justin is an assistant professor of animal sciences and also an extension specialist, and he is with the Division of Animal Sciences here at the University of Missouri. And today he is going to talk about drought-resilient grazing systems that can be adapted to the drought conditions that we've been experiencing. So without further ado, Dr. Sexten.
Thank you for the opportunity to come visit with you today, and I recognize that I'm the last thing between you and lunch. As an animal scientist and a nutritionist, I know the impacts of what's going on. The sugar high of the donuts is beginning to taper off. So what I'm going to talk about today is drought-tolerant or resilient grazing systems, and mostly under the context of the animal, but to combine that with the plant and pasture interaction at the end. And so you've seen some indication of the drought monitor in almost every talk that we've talked about today, but to frame my comments, the thing I guess I want to point out is that we've just experienced a drought, and so it's fresh in our mind. But the reality of it is, from an animal perspective, as we develop grazing systems, we have to deal really with four things: is when the drought occurs. And that in most livestock systems we look at in Missouri, we assume it's going to be relatively dry in August. And so that's a given. Whether that is termed a drought or not, we realize that we're going to have a fairly low forage growth during that time. And then the duration. This drought, at least from an animal perspective, started for us in April, and that it was relatively dry at that point in time, and what we expect from a hay and forage harvest standpoint was reduced by about a third, maybe a half in some places in April and May. So the start of this actually, from a livestock perspective, started much earlier than from an agronomic perspective in many cases. The magnitude and distribution of this drought is one that in many cases we expect drought somewhere in the Midwest from a livestock perspective, but the reality of it is we have really gotten outside of all forage shipping areas, in that anywhere we would normally get forage or feed was also experiencing drought, which from a planning perspective makes it a bit of a challenge. And so from a planning standpoint, one of the things that's happened as we think about developing grazing systems, one thing we might think about, kind of relative to the comment that was just made, is, well, let's develop forage systems that are drought resilient all of the time, and then when we have an abundance of rain, we'll have greater forage growth, and when we don't, we're planning for those. The challenge that we face from a livestock perspective today is really a land use challenge. That's our largest cost from a livestock perspective, and so land cost is changing due to the commodity structure that has come in place as it relates to corn and soybean production. In that, if you look at CRP acres for the state of Missouri, we've seen nearly a 19% decline from 2007 to 2012. And so those marginal lands that we do not necessarily use for grazing or pasture lands, except for drought years, I use this as an indicator of what's happening to grasslands across the state more so. If we look at corn and soybean acres for Missouri combined, we've seen a 9.2 increase in planted acres from 8.15 million in 2007 to 8.9 million in 2012. And so those acres had to come from somewhere, and more than likely they were higher slope acres that were at one time in pasture. Missouri was historically number 2 in cow-calf production. We were surpassed by Oklahoma, largely because less acres in Oklahoma are convertible. Last year we were surpassed by Nebraska and maintained number 3, but Oklahoma was under the incidence of drought as well. And so as we watch the cow-calf industry or livestock industry as a whole, it'll change, develop around convertible acres. And so that cost is something that we have to be cognizant of as it relates to, from a livestock perspective, and how we develop grazing systems. If we look at the rent for pasture, what is termed good pasture as determined by our cash rental rate survey, It's gone up 5% in 3 years. And then if we look at timber pasture rent, or maybe that's improved as a silvopasture, or maybe it's just trees that the cows are turned in on, we've seen almost well over a twofold increase, 100% increase in that cost from a standpoint of we just are running out of acres to put cows on. And so we see an increased use of what is considered marginal lands for anything that we can put cows or goats or sheep or some sort of livestock to utilize those forages. So one of the things that I guess I want to stress from a grazing system standpoint, the number one thing to develop a grazing system around that's resilient to drought is it needs to be flexible. Because as indicated previously, we're going to have a high variation in moisture availability. Some years will be deficit, some years will be surplus. And so the one thing we have to worry about is that land is a fixed asset, and if we have fewer cows, it's just divided by a smaller number, and that cost increases on a per animal basis. Producers find that depreciation cost is one of our next largest expenses, and so once you've invested in a piece of machinery, if you reduce the number of cows to make a flexible grazing system, it's just divided by a smaller number, cost per head goes up. And labor is also fixed. As we look at these three costs, our grazing systems need to be built around a flexible stocking rate with them in mind. And that's kind of what I'm going to focus on. So there are really 5 keys as I look at developing drought-resistant pastures. The first is to recognize that water is a limiting factor, and you may be thinking that seems obvious, but it's actually not the water that you're thinking about. We need to maintain a forage base. We utilize sacrifice pastures, match the supply and demand availability to the animal, and then lastly, increase pasture diversity. And the reason that I put pasture diversity and forage last is because that is something that requires a significant change, a change in land use, a change in the forages that are going to be utilized, and a change in productivity, and I'll kind of point out why that's relevant at the end. When I talk about water as the limiting factor, the number one thing is developing a drought-resistant grazing system. As found this year, more livestock decisions are based off of stock water than anything else. In that when it doesn't rain, pasture doesn't grow. That's intrinsic. But when it doesn't rain and ponds dry up or lakes dry up, that's a whole different aspect from a livestock perspective. And when we get over here into these 80 and 90 degree temperatures in the summertime, we see water intake double for growing stock. Intake of water increases on lactating cows as well. And then when we get to the point where it is extremely hot, those cows just reduce milk production. So water intake maybe doesn't increase, but milk production declines, and as a result, calf growth will slow. And so as we develop a drought-resilient grazing system, there's 3 things relative to water that has to be considered. The first is it has to be available. A spring that has never gone dry ever before, if it's still wet this year, it's likely a pretty reliable spring. Okay, and so it has to be available and reliable. Those of you who paid attention this summer in the state realize we drilled a whole lot of wells that were not planned earlier in the year to try to increase availability and reliability. Potable water became an extreme problem late in the summer. Blue-green algae blooms that started in stock water. So in many cases, we may have had a pond that was available and reliable, but became completely unusable because of a blue-green algae bloom that occurred. And so now that stock had to be moved. Water is the most expensive nutrient for us to transport. And so developing a grazing system where you have a reliable water source, even if it is rural water at higher costs, allows you to be prepared for a worst-case scenario where that is your limiting factor. I tell producers that we can talk a lot about feed and pasture resources, but an animal that doesn't drink is dead in about 3 days at best. And so water is number one. The next thing that we want to talk about, I like to use a financial example relative to this in that our pasture base has to be maintained. And so if we are continuing to graze beyond about 1,500 pounds of dry matter, for you non-forage agronomists in the audience, that's about 3 inches of forage height. If we can maintain 3 inches of forage height, that should be considered our savings account or bank. We begin to impact root growth significantly as we graze shorter than this. And so if we can maintain this, regardless of how bad it's getting, when it does recover, when the hurricane does come, the plant will begin to regrow much quicker. The other thing that the data would suggest is that if we can maintain 1,500 pounds of dry matter an acre or 3 inches of cover, we've suppressed weed growth as well. When we get below 3 inches of residual forage height, we allow those weeds to come in and propagate those pastures. And this is an example of some data that we've collected actually on producers' farms this year. This was in the middle of July, and then this is at the end of July on this same farm. And so what we did with these producers was said, when you get to 1,500 pounds of dry matter, get the cattle off. Move them out. You are starting to rob from pasture growth in the future. There's no incentive to graze it any further into the ground, and so it's robbing Peter to pay Paul at that point. And so that brings me to my third point of sacrifice pasture, in that some place on the operation we need to develop as part of a grazing system a place that is either to be restored or renovated, or some place that we're willing to sacrifice and congregate animals. We can feed our stored forages here. We're going to deposit a large amount of nutrients and begin the renovation progress. If we have a pasture of infected tall fescue that we want to renovate, or we have a pasture that has been a feeding area that needs reseeded, these are opportunities where we can feed our stored forages here and deposit phosphorus and potassium in those areas to start the reseeding process. We can also maintain desirable pasture cover on our good pastures. This allows those pastures to be held at 1,500 pounds of dry matter and not continue to overgraze them over the entire summer. And then we also concentrate water and feeding costs. As I mentioned, labor becomes a significant cost to us, in that if we congregate these cows in a sacrifice area, we put everything in one pasture with a reliable water source. Now that's the one place that we have to go to transport feed and water to, as opposed to having the cattle spread all over the farm. And so our feeding costs are congregated there as well. Now, what I've talked about so far is kind of management of the forage base, and now what I want to shift to is dynamic decisions that can be made. And so when I talk about a grazing system or making grazing system choices, these are things that we can do in the middle of the drought that allow us to prioritize forage utilization, maintain that forage base, and survive the drought without making a wholesale pasture change, without reseeding to some other new forage. And so this is a demonstration of the number of classes of animals that will be on most farms. We've got a cow that just gave birth to a calf here. This is a cow that's about a month from calving here. This is a cow that has a calf that's about 6 to 7 months old and can be weaned at any time, weaned or removed from the dam. And then this is a growing replacement heifer that will sometime become one of these 3 cows. And so what I've put on this slide is, this is how we should prioritize our forage. Not every animal should have the same pass at the forage when we're to the point of making critical decisions. If we're short of forage due to drought, then this cow, who is in late gestation, is the most critical. And all I have to do is go out and sort these animals at a minimal cost, in that she gets the best forage available. Maybe these other animals go to the sacrifice area, and I continue the gestating animals to graze what forage is growing. These would be second in terms of priority. These cows who have just calved, they are lactating and have a high nutrient demand. These 2 groups over here have a flexible nutrient demand. I'll talk about that in a minute. This calf is old enough to be separated from the cow, and we can reduce her maintenance costs by sorting them. And so this is something that requires no further change in a pasture, no modification of the pasture system. It is simply going out and sorting those cows by nutrient demand. And we can think of it from an agronomic perspective, in that we have some soils that are more productive than others. So we have variable rate fertilization. Same basic concept, only on the animal side. Okay, this is a very busy graph, but from an environmental standpoint, we're going to talk about this for the next 5 slides, so I'll take time to set it up. In that this is the temperature over here on the left. The red line, anytime the black line goes above the red line, that's heat stress to an animal. Okay, and so you will see that we have heat stress in late May, June, July, and August. Okay, that's right in here. The yellow line is cold stress, not relevant today, because it's actually 50 some odd degrees today, so that's even less relevant. The green line is our cool season forage production curve, and so we have this classic spike of forage availability in April and May, and then it slows down in June and July and August, and then we have this fall peak that we'll see again. And so what I want to point out with this environmental condition is we have heat stress occurring in June, July, and August that also corresponds with our lowest level of forage. Okay, and so we're here to talk about drought today, but in reality, we're dealing with heat stress, low moisture, and low forage production every year just by the physiology of cool season plants. Okay, and so as we develop a grazing system, how can we make it so that our nutrient demand is the lowest during June, July, and August, or at least the most flexible? Let's think about it like that. Okay, and so this is the nutrient demand of a cow. It's the highest 2 months after she gives birth to a calf, and it's the lowest when that calf is weaned or removed from her so that she no longer has to lactate. Okay, and so the yellow lines indicate that that calf is old enough to no longer have to nurse a cow. Okay, and so I use a beef example here. If you wanted to use a sheep or a small ruminant, all you have to do is they only lactate for about 120 days. A beef cow lactates for about 205. A dairy model would have that cow lactating for 305 days. Okay, and so for the most part, immediately after birth, we see the highest nutrient requirement. A ruminant animal, from a forage standpoint, needs 60 days to be functional to graze on its own. Okay, so a calf at birth, 60 days later, will have a functional rumen that it can digest forage and will no longer need its mother. Okay, and so that's the flexibility that we have in that after 60 days of age, that calf can be on its own, and we would wean the calf from the cow, and reduce dry matter intake. Because at some point, stocking rate, as I said, is our most important management tool. Cow will eat 2.5% of her body weight when she is lactating or giving milk. If she is not lactating, it's 2% of her body weight. So for every 100 pounds of her body weight, I save a half a pound of forage. And that doesn't sound like very much, but on a 1,200 pound cow, that's 6 pounds of forage a day. 1,400 pound cow, 7 pounds a day. And so the way we like to think about that is every 6th day we got for free if she's not lactating. Right? It would take 6 days approximately to build up enough forage while she is non-lactating that I just got another day. And as I work with producers this summer, every day was valuable that they saved. And so this is an opportunity to where we haven't changed our forage base at all. We have not changed anything but our management in that the calves are no longer nursing the cow. And so that's ultimate in terms of flexibility of management. So this is going to be the calving season. This is the green line that I've shown you already. This is how our forage is going to grow under normal weather conditions. Okay? I know that normal is highly variable based off of this morning, but this is what we're going to go with. Okay? This is the diagram that you've already seen. Remember, peak nutrient demand occurs 2 months after birth. And this is when she is no longer lactating. And so if we think about developing a grazing system where we have calves born in February, that calf is 60 days old by April 1st, right? And so April 1st, that calf could be weaned from his dam if needed. If drought sets in here in June and July, I could wean that calf and he would be adequate in terms of age. So selecting calving season gives me the opportunity to build in some flexibility. Now, this is not something you can change overnight. Changing calving season occurred at least 9 months prior to this occurrence, but it's something we can think about long term. If we think about April calving, which is common in the state, this is when peak nutrient demand and peak forage supply occur simultaneously, and those calves by the start of June would be 60 days old. Certainly weanable at that point. Many of our producers don't like dealing with 60-day-old calves, but does give us some flexibility. If we look at June calving, which is increasingly popular because people don't like to deal with cold weather calving, this is a system where if we want to make a drought-resistant system, it does not work at all. And the reason for that is our peak nutrient demand occurs at about the same time. Well, it may not be a meteorological drought, it's certainly hot and dry for us, and the amount of forage that we're going to have available is limited, and those cows are at peak nutrient demand. October calving. In many cases, we look at this and say our supply and our demand by the black line are completely inverse. This would make no sense at all. But if you think about it from a drought management standpoint, our peak nutrient demand occurs here, where we're feeding stored forages anyway. And then when we get out here into March, April, and May, these cows are, this drop right here, this is when we wean the calf. That's a voluntary decision by the producer. At that point, those calves can be marketed, or they can stay on the cow, utilize this excess forage, and then early June and July, we can wean those calves later. Okay, and so October actually is one of the more flexible management strategies developing a grazing system for drought, because the lowest nutrient demand occurs when we have the most forage available. And animals have the unique ability to store fat at this point in time that they could use as energy later on. Okay, pregnancy diagnosis. This doesn't seem to have anything to do with forage management, but it is producer management from a standpoint of how can we vary stocking rate, in that we can reduce forage demand by determining which cows are no longer pregnant, and they can be marketed. This is what many producers did this summer, is that they started to check those cows for pregnancy, and those that were non-pregnant were sold. They were sold for income to buy purchase feed, and they were sold to reduce dry matter intake of the herd globally. Effectively, is that every cow that leaves the farm leaves feed for another cow that stays. The challenge that we get into when we start doing pregnancy diagnosis is that there is a per head cost investment, but if we're able to cull that cow earlier, we can save $150 a head in feed costs over a 100-day feeding period if we think about drought lasting for 3 months in June, July, and August, or we market that cow in July and then we have September to accumulate some forages. Okay? Culling gives us the opportunity to sell those cows and reduce forage demand. And so culling is something that we can do at any point in time. It is a very flexible management strategy. The challenge that we have in culling as a drought management strategy is now we have a cash flow problem for the next 3 years. In that once we sell that cow, we have to replace her, and that replacement heifer won't produce an outcome until at least 2 years down the road. And so yes, we've gotten down we've addressed a short-term problem of forage availability, but now 3 years down the road we have a smaller cow herd that takes 3 to 5 years to rebuild. And so many of the decisions that were made this summer will impact the consumer later on by a smaller cow herd, and the producer significantly, because they're buying more expensive replacements that ultimately don't come online for another 14 months at best, and maybe 2 years in the worst case. So culling is an easy management strategy, but it's one with many hidden costs. It does allow us to focus nutrient demands on productive cows. It allows us to think about we can change our breeding season timing. We cull cows that are calving late or not coincide with our desired breeding season. It does offer the opportunity for genetic change or improvement in genetics. And this is one of the things I like to remind producers, that while all of their cows are great, by definition, half of them are below average. Okay, and I like to tell the students that joke too. They don't like it. But the point here is that everybody who says, well, I don't want to sell that cow, she's a great one, well, at least half of them are below average and would be candidates for lower productivity when we get to the point where we don't have enough cash to buy feed, or feed isn't available. When we're trucking feed in from the Dakotas, the cost to maintain that cow is significant, such that she better be in the upper 1/3 to stay around relative to the expense you're going to incur. All right, so now I want to talk about development. Those were all strategies to match nutrient supply and demand. Here's where I want to kind of address the opportunity to develop grazing systems that have a variety of forage resources to help us address a drought. And so the green line I've maintained consistent. This is our cool season forage production curve that occurs under normal weather conditions. And so if we don't have normal weather conditions, what we will see is just a reduction in this productivity, but the curve, the physiological curve, largely stays the same. And then one of the things we can do to add diversity in our forages is add a warm season forage. These are forages that are more drought tolerant in that they tolerate a higher growing temperature. They require less water to grow. As a result, they are many times less digestible than our cool season forages, but they do offer us an improved distribution. Okay, and so here's an opportunity where June and July and August I could have some forages available. The challenge that I have with warm season grasses, as you can see, they are available largely from June to August. How did I start this talk out? Land use is our most significant cost. And so a pasture system that I can use for 3 months of a year comes at a significant cost from a standpoint of those are acres I'm going to devote to productivity for only 3 months a year. And so if I'm only going to have them used for 3 months of a year, they either need to be extremely productive during that time period or be extremely cheap, because effectively the distribution of forage during this time is minimal. And there are opportunities I'll talk about in a minute, where these are cool season perennials, where that is the only forage grown on that land. An alternative would be warm season perennials. Okay? An alternative would be a warm season annual crop. And a warm season annual crop could be planted in May and then harvested in June, July, August, and September. And then these cool season small grain crops such as wheat, rye, triticale could be planted on that same acre. And so from a management standpoint, this gives me the opportunity to capture that acre in the middle of the summer when drought is potentially setting in. And then late in the fall, when I get some fall rains, I can plant a grain crop that I will be able to use in February, March, and early April prior to my cool season perennial forages coming on. The challenge, and this season was an excellent example of that, is we had a number of producers that tried this planting of warm season annual crops in May. And well, they need water too. And so, normally we can count on some rain, at least till June to get it up. And so we really didn't have a lot of May rains to get that started. And then if it did get started, here in about June and July, if you followed our news releases at all, then we started dealing with the nitrate issues that were associated with these plants not metabolizing nitrogen correctly in the annual crops. And so this is not a system for the faint of heart, because you have a higher establishment cost. You have you have planting risk that you endure with these annuals that you don't necessarily incur with the warm season. And so I don't have all the answers as it relates to use of warm season forages. I think long term there's a place for a percentage of acres that can be used as warm season, but certainly not one I would build my entire system around because of the land use challenges. This is the steepest forage growth curve you can ever see, and I'm not sure what the corn stalk availability growth curve is, but it's 100% available after the combine goes through the field. And so this curve actually is designed to represent harvest progress across the United States, perhaps, is the way to think about that. And we should maybe move this harvest progress over to like June this year, in that we started harvesting silage very early. And so while we haven't, I started out this talk talking about the converted acres to corn. The one thing that as we develop grazing systems, those are acres that we need to continue to focus on using those residues. There's a competing interest for those residues for biomass harvest, and that stover use for a number of different outlets. But corn stalks will carry a cow, as an example, for 45 to 60 days. An acre of corn stalks will carry a cow 45 to 60 days. And so this is an opportunity where in the late fall, when we'd like to be resting our cool season pastures and our warm season pastures are gone, we can carry those cows at a minimum of 45 days with corn stalks, so long as we have what I started with, water availability. and maybe more importantly, as we get further down the road, fence availability. And that we don't like fence rows anymore, and we like ponds even less. And so if we don't have water or fence, it's hard to graze those stocks, and so we get into a harvest model. But in places where we can maintain water availability and a minimal amount of fence, the alternative forage of corn stalks is one that will get us at least 45, maybe 60 days further down the road. And so this is just an illustration of alternative forages. I like to use pictures, and that one of the things I did not talk about, this was Bermuda grass. This is a warm season where it is a perennial grass, and we can go in and interseed some rye in that in the wintertime and essentially double the use of those acres. And so Bermuda grass offers us an opportunity, depending on the part of the state or nation that you might be in. This is some of the warm season perennials that is being used. This is some Caucasian blue stem, big blue stem, little blue stem, those type of native forages. Again, the biggest problem with those is they only allow us about 2, maybe 3 months of grazing. This is an example of pearl millet, one of the warm season annuals that gives us an opportunity to use acres twice a year, where we would use some of these cool season small grain crops such as rye or turnips late in the winter and early in the spring. Corn stalks, as I mentioned earlier, and some of the legumes. Bird's foot trefoil here allows us to increase pasture diversity. Again, it's a cool season crop, but reduces the amount of nitrogen that we're going to need to supply in that system. And so from a kind of a summary standpoint, the one thing that I guess I will leave you with as it relates to drought management of pasture systems is flexibility is ultimately what is mandated. In that, you know, the joke I like to tell is I can guarantee you the weather will change. And so that's not even a joke, that's the truth. And actually I have a joke about weathermen, but I don't know how many weather people are in here, so I'm going to keep that down. But the point is that, you know, this is not something we're going to see every day, and to plan for that is somewhat short-sighted, because we set our beef production system up to be managed around a constrained system that doesn't always exist. And so what I want to plan for, and what I've left you with, is a way to design a system with a tremendous amount of flexibility from a nutrient demand standpoint. And some of the forages that are available are not wholesale changes. They are forages, as Dr. Roberts likes to say, that are readily available and capable to be implemented into a system. But it is one system that we need to think about globally as opposed to reacting to most recent history. So with that, I'll answer any questions, or I'll let you talk about what the lunch plans are, which is maybe your greater interest.
Thank you very much, Justin.